If you're in this fight or
Right.
flight state all the time, you're holding on to things. Your tissues are tough. Your tissues are just ready for, some sort of response to a threat. It doesn't allow us to rest, digest, and eliminate. And when we get locked into that sympathetic dominant state, our body holds on to things. And that bioaccumulation is ultimately what leads to the damage that could be accumulated on a DNA level. It could lead to chronic inflammation, and that chronic inflammation could lead to immune dysregulation and all sorts of things.
Anil, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Siim. Great to see you.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you back on the show. And the last time we had, kind of a general overview about precision medicine and how your genes and your environment affect your health each individual separately. But I wanted to bring you back to talk about something that is more and more relevant in today's world, which is toxin exposure and detoxification, etc. Where living in a very, let's say, polluted world nowadays, both in terms of the environment as well as the food supply, and a lot of people appear to have struggles with these kinds of things. So yeah, we'll do like a masterclass on all things detoxification, and I want to start with maybe you giving your framework or opinion about detoxification as a phenomenon itself, because I think people might have the idea that it's kind of a scam or some sort of a fraudster thing, that drink your detox smoothies and those kind of things, that it's just not pseudoscience, that it's not an actual thing. So what is your take on it as a precision medicine doctor?
That's a great question. Thank you again for having me back on. I think this is a very important topic because what it relates to is essentially looking at the exposome. The human exposome refers to, the entire amount of environmental factors that are coming into interface with our own internal ecosystem. So the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, all those factors have a significant impact at exposing us to different forms of environmental exposures. And those exposures could be found in multiple different forms from different sources. The statistics around the environmental EPA and the chemical exposures has grown significantly over the past 20 years. So we're living in a very toxic world. We have this very unique little bubble. I call it our little, a bubble that we're constantly being inundated with different forms of exposure, whether it's PFAS and these forever chemicals, from Teflon products and derivatives to microplastics, organophosphates with different pesticides and herbicides, phthalates and parabens, which are found in our cosmetic products and our different cleaning products and things of that nature. All of those things have a significance on our total environmental exposure. And that burden could lead to, inundating our detox pathways and channels. So, and that goes back down to your genetic blueprint. And it's almost like looking at it in the context of pharmacogenetics, which refers to how your DNA blueprint influences the rate of metabolism of certain drugs and toxins. So with that being said, there's some individuals that are rapid metabolizers, there's some individuals that are slow metabolizers, and that, gene environmental interface and or mismatch is where it leads to the potential for the bioaccumulation of these different compounds within our system. And that bioaccumulation is ultimately what leads to the damage that could be accumulated on a DNA level, right? It could lead to chronic inflammation. And that chronic inflammation could lead to, further, accumulation and immune dysregulation and all sorts of things. So we live in a very toxic world. There's multiple different exposures that we have, that we're constantly being, inundated with. And it's identifying and mitigating those exposures and supporting our body's natural endogenous detox pathways.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's like we live in an environment, and some of us will be more affected by these environmental pollutants due to genetics. And one great example of this is me and my wife. I lived in a molded house for 2 decades without any symptoms and without any change in how I feel or anything like that. whereas my wife came and within a few weeks she already developed some symptoms related to mold exposure. So there is a lot of individual differences to how people react to various toxins, like even microplastics or PFAS and heavy metals, and all those things are very dependent of the individual genetics. But yeah, I guess people already know that we are living in a very polluted world with a lot of problems in the food supply as well as the air that we breathe and the water we drink. But is detox itself a thing that our bodies are able to do? So that can we actually excrete these different pollutants and toxins, and and is it just related to your liver? So like a lot of people might say that your liver is the detox organ and that's all you have. That you can't really do anything else. Like if you can detox things, then it's gonna be done by the liver, and that's it.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and it's one that's kind of plagued me through my academic training historically. Because you speak to other doctors, and they're going to be like, "Oh, the concept of detox is kind of foreign to the allopathic language and landscape, especially from a conventional toxicology perspective. This concept of detoxing and drinking a smoothie, or doing, I don't know." Colon cleanses and all this other stuff for detox is kind of a foreign concept. And it just depends on what literature you're looking at and what research you're choosing, and I say choose, to pay attention to. Because when it comes down to it, with our current understanding of N of one medicine and basically how everybody's unique blueprint is different, our environmental exposures, like you alluded to, hey, I lived in a mold infested home for 20 years. I didn't have those symptomatic presentations versus Inca. When she was there, she's automatically started expressing signs and symptoms of mold toxicity. You know, I think that's the what we need to be looking at is that environmental gene interface and how that influences everybody differently. So to sit here and and have a conversation around detox, it's very important to understand the different factors that make up phase 1, 2, and 3 detoxification, because each phase is very unique and specific to the individual, with arguably, yes, the liver being one of the primary organs of detoxification, but so is the bowels, the urinary systems, and the kidney, right? And even sweating and the lymphatic system. All of those different organs and systems play an instrumental role with the transformation and elimination of these various metabolites. Because again, if you understand the cytochrome P450, and again, using the context of pharmacogenetics and looking at how we're metabolizing things based on a rate of metabolism, right? And understanding even phase 1 detox, which has to do with basically turning these fat soluble or water soluble toxins into a more neutral molecule after cytochrome P450 through reduction process. That's a very important concept to look at, because there's so many different nutritional cofactors that go into that phase 1 detox, including that cytochrome P450 blueprint, that everybody is different. Right? They're either slow or rapid metabolizers or intermediate. And each, TD6, 3A4, 1A2, whatever the heck it is, everybody's blueprint and rate of metabolism for these different compounds are different. So understanding your unique genetic blueprint is instrumental at identifying specifically, hey, do I have, issues with mold? Do I have issues with organophosphates? Do I have more issues with heavy metals, right? From a phase 1 detox perspective, because after phase 1 detox, and they basically hydroxylate these different compounds, and they try to make these heavy metals, or, whatever it is, chemicals, more water soluble, sometimes those post phase 1 intermediate metabolites are more toxic than the actual toxin to begin with.
Hmm.
And then, after the phase 1 detox pathway, we have to look at phase 2: conjugation, acetylation, methylation, glucuronidation, those conjugated pathways that influence the further refining of that intermediate metabolite into a more safer element for detoxification. And then
Hmm.
phase 3, is it going to go to the urine? Is it gonna go to the bowels? Is it, not being conjugated appropriately and there's enterohepatic recirculation? And that enterohepatic recirculation is a big issue with mold toxicity. So what enterohepatic recirculation refers to is that, these metabolites go into the bile, the gallbladder and the bile, right? And the bile is squirted into the small intestine and and the bile is what gives feces its brown color. But up to 98% of bile is recirculated and reabsorbed throughout the digestive process, right? And that process of enterohepatic recirculation could lead to these different toxins to be accumulated and recirculated within the system. And this is where different binders come into play to help, work as a molecular sponge and go in there and soak this stuff up and help you eliminate it and poop it out, right? To prevent, that toxic, vicious cycle of recirculation. So when
Mm,
it comes down to detox, to question whether or not it's a real phenomenon is very silly. To question the role of biotransformation, detoxification, elimination, I think it breeds a larger conversation about, are you moving your lymph and exercising and sweating? Are you passing your bowels on a regular basis? Not once a day, once every other day, but
mhm.
maybe multiple times a day. Right? And what's your urine look like? Are you drinking enough water to go in there and support, the flushing effect of some of those water soluble toxins from the kidney system and network, right?
Yeah.
And then even from like a German homotoxicological model, I'm really big into Dr. Reckewig's work in homotoxicology, and he proposed this concept of homotoxins and he has this beautiful chart. Would love to pull it up and share, but you could Google the chart and look up Reckewig's model of homotoxicology. And he has these different phases of detoxification and elimination in the system. And Reckewig was a homotoxicologist in the 1950s in Germany that basically proposed this model. And in this model, it basically outlines whether or not you could appropriate biotransform some of these compounds in your system. And essentially, he divided into multiple different phases. And when the first phase he described was a humoral phase, right? And the humoral phase referred to basically the humors of the body, the fluids of the body. And if you can't remove the homotoxin appropriately, your body's going to inflame. And if the body inflames, ultimately, then it could, and there's recirculation of those inflammatory intermediate byproducts, it impregnates the tissue. And once there's impregnation of that intermediate metabolite into the tissue, right? And this could be toxic tagalongs and different metabolites or whatever it is from detox intermediate byproducts, it moves into the matrix phase. And in the matrix phase, it's stored, right? And then it leads to architectural shifts in that extracellular matrix in the bioaccumulation of some of those products, right? And then ultimately it moves into a cellular phase where that accumulation of toxic compounds leads to dedifferentiation, which is essentially autoimmune and cancer. Right. So
Mm,
this bioaccumulation of these different compounds and its intermediates that could be more toxic than the actual, element itself could lead to long-term consequences and cellular dedifferentiation towards autoimmune and cancer. So, it's a very important concept. I
mhm.
think, in German medicine and German new medicine, they look at supporting what's called drainage, right? And that drainage, has to deal with opening up the different channels, in the system to further help allow the body to eliminate these different kind of byproducts. And that's your
Right.
different kind of German remedies, yeah, Picana and so forth, drainage
Mm.
remedies.
Yeah, in today's world, people are in like a greater need of eliminating these compounds from their body because the input is so much greater. And I would also, argue that the modern lifestyle is deficient in stimulating these detox pathways sufficiently. So we are not sweating as much, we're not moving as much, we're not stimulating the lymph as much, or at least the average person doesn't, and their liver isn't working optimally. They might have a liver impairment to a certain degree. So there is a like a deficiency in detox, for lack of a better word. That when the input of these toxins is so much greater and the output, the excretion of them, isn't catching up, and that's why you will also people might also develop certain of these complications related to the toxic buildup, even if it's something related to as simple as fatigue or sleep problems or some rashes, some skin conditions, minor autoimmune conditions. Even these minor things can be tied to this toxin accumulation to a certain extent, and some of them are, directly also linked even to things like fertility issues and, potentially cancer as well.
You said it. So the clinical manifestations and symptomatic presentations could vary based on the allostatic load or bioaccumulation due to the lack of biotransformation or detox, and could ultimately just manifest in everybody a little bit differently, right? Wherever
Mm,
those sore spots are, whatever it is, skin, neurological, mitochondrial deficits and fatigue, neurofatigue, neuroinflammation. All of those are clinical manifestations, signs and symptoms associated with, that total toxic body burden due to that allostatic load and that environmental gene mismatch.
mm.
Absolutely.
I want to take a quick break to let you know about my favorite wellness devices, which are the bond charge red light therapy devices. You've probably seen many of your favorite longevity influencers using these red light therapy devices, but do they actually work? Yes, they do. Red light therapy has been shown to have many benefits on skin anti-aging, hormone optimization, pain management, and even exercise performance. I use my device every day for 15 minutes, especially during the winter months when there's not much sunlight. It increases my energy in the morning and makes my skin glow. Just check out the testimonials on the Bond Charge website for the before and after pictures of other people. Most radiotherapy devices don't have the right wavelengths of light, which might mean you're not getting the claimed benefits. Bond Charge uses the exact wavelengths of light used in research, and they also have near-infrared light that's beneficial to the joints. Head over to bondcharge.com and use the code SIIM, SIIM, for a 15% discount.
Yeah. And you mentioned certain of these pathways and, let's say, routes of detox as well, such as sweating and urination and feces and lymph drainage. These things are actually very, everyday things that people do. Everyone goes to the bathroom every day, and everyone, sweats at least to a certain extent a little bit, and people don't really think as sweating or urination as a detox pathway, but it is, like you said, very important, and actually one of the major pathways by which your body excretes a lot of these toxins. So maybe we can start with, what are some maybe these everyday activities that people should work on optimizing, these simpler things, low hanging fruit, that would support lowering that toxic burden on a daily basis. And we're not gonna go into these more genetic details yet, but some are more like simplistic things. So how can people, make sure that they urinate enough, or stimulate the lymph enough, or what's a sufficient amount of sweating, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's all N of one based on, where you live, the lifestyle that you have, because arguably, going for a run in a city like New York or DC or LA, where the air impact,
Mm,
outdoors, and the air quality is so bad that in certain areas, right, that could actually be more detrimental, right? So
mm,
looking again, at the actual kind of spatial exposures and how that influences, everything is very important. So, is there a correct recipe for the person? That's a great question. And I think that number one, I think most importantly is identifying and mitigating and removing sources of exposure to that toxin first and foremost, right? Because
mm,
we don't know what we're being exposed to unless you test, right? And there's different forms of testing out there, provoke tests versus, spontaneous tests. Usually urinary metabolites. Is blood better than, urine, and so on and so forth. And I think each one could be debated and has its clinical validity and utility in addressing N of one, kind of clinical management. So number one, what's our greatest threat? And obviously, we could do our best to filter our water and, make sure we're hydrating on great quality water, and whether it's filtered, double reverse osmosis, alkalis, and there's all sorts of different, is it deuterium removed, from it? There's all these different things with water. Then the food, right? Organic, inorganic, and basically hormones in the meat and antibiotics in the meat as well. So it's being mindful of those accumulate exposures. Not to mention, our EMFs are a big part of it, right? This distortive factor, right? That is a part of our exposome, right? And if we're bathing in EMFs in our bedroom, not good. The Austrians, there's um, a great company in Austria called GeoVital that basically trains individuals to identify major sources of EMF exposures in their home and in their office, wherever where they spend a lot of time. And they basically provide tools and resources to mitigate that electromagnetic field stress. I feel as though the Austrians are really ahead of their time when it comes down to geopathic stress and looking
Mhm.
at how EMF plays a role. Our cleaning products, our cosmetic products, phthalates and parabens, all those things are really big things. Our cookware, huge,
Mm,
with
yeah.
Teflon and nonstick. So first and foremost, we need to do an audit of what's coming into our exposome, what we're being, exposed to. And actually, me and the American Board of Precision Medicine represent a new initiative here in the U.S. called the Human Exposome Project, which is basically kind of picking up where the Human Genome Project left off 25 years ago and looking at how that environmental gene interface and how that influences things. So, you know, I think number one is identifying those exposures, mitigating and removing chronic exposure. Number two, what could you do, to help facilitate detox? That's a loaded question. It depends on what we're being exposed to. If you want to go to the whole concept of mold toxicity, and I know there's like the saying out there, kill, bind, sweat. You don't really sweat out mycotoxin. That's kind of something so it just really depends on what your total toxic body burden is, what it
Mhm.
shows, and how to address each one of those kind of components in a targeted fashion through targeted detox. Generally speaking, though, what could you do at home right now from a lifestyle standpoint on top of, mitigating exposure would be drinking enough water per day, And honestly, that amount and concentration could vary from person to person. What I tell people to do is just look at their urine, right? Look at your urine. You don't want it concentrated. You don't want to see bubbles. You don't want to see it cloudy, right? You want to see a nice straw colored urine, right? That could be vary from day to day based on physical activity, stress, exposure, and sweating. In
Mhm.
regards to sweating, what's a magic recipe? I haven't seen any studies done specifically to identify the specific sweating concentration or amount. Go out
Yeah.
there and move. Right? Break a sweat, right? Have fun with it, whether it's playing a sport or doing, a martial art like jujitsu or, being in a sauna, to help mobilize some of this stuff out of your system. Fantastic. Go and sweat. You got to sweat. I do sauna therapy at minimum, 3 to 5 times a week. Another very important thing to consideration is fiber. Are you
Mm,
pooping enough?
mm,
And, do you know how many patients I have? Normal thyroid function, normal-ish diet, and all that other stuff, but they don't poop on a regular basis,
mm,
right? And when you start
yeah.
unpacking the microbiome association, they have some microbes that are associated with dysbiosis that could be affecting that. They have maybe sympathetic dominancies in their vagal nerve tone, right, or lack thereof, that's influencing the migrating motor complex of their myenteric plexus of their gastrointestinal system that slows down bowel motility, right? We have patients that might have some thyroid issues, but poop, man, that's that's fun stuff. You wanna make sure you're pooping a
Yeah.
lot, enough. You don't want
Right.
diarrhea. You want, a normal cadence of bowel movements, 2 to 3 times a day to be keeping up with, your normal digestive physiology, and the type of stool matters, and
Right.
that there's a whole Bristol stool chart where you could look at, is it hard and rocky or is it, mushy and stuff. All those things are clinical clues on what's happening in the digestive process, the microbiota, bowel elimination, and so forth. Because when you start taking fiber, watch what happens. The fiber goes in there, feeds short chain fatty acids needed for the microbiota and the mucin production on the colonocytes and supports a healthy eubiosis gut terrain. Things start working better. Elimination starts working better.
Yeah.
I can't stress pooping enough
Mm.
inappropriately, all right? And
Yeah.
then lymphatic mobilization is critical, right? So, what do you do for that? It's gotta run, gotta exercise. You gotta rebound and jump on a trampoline. You could jump rope, and infuse some sort of, movement that's going to, kind of, movement that's gonna stimulate the lymph as a whole, right? In
Mm.
my office, we have a machine called Flowpresso from New Zealand, FDA registered machine that's been shown to do whole body lymphatic sequential compression. I love it. It is like a nice warm hug. You see these folks out there that are using like just the leg stuff, the leg
Mhm.
compressors, right in their
Right.
recovery. That's cute. But the bulk of our lymph nodes are actually concentrated in the abdomen, the
Mm.
renal region, the epitrochlear lymph nodes, in our arms, right? And then we have some other lymph nodes throughout, axillary lymph nodes and our thoracic duct. All of that lymphatic stimulation needs to be addressed appropriately. And once you start mobilizing the lymph, that's when you should sweat. So mobilize the lymph in
Mm.
some shape or form and then sweat. Right.
Mm.
If you
So
don't
you
sweat, you're going to just recircle some of that stuff into your system, and that's not good. And then you
Gotcha.
hydrate. I love rehydrating on coconut water, love it. So I think that's a part of a healthy routine. And not to mention sleep. Do you know how
Mm.
much stuff is removed into your system in sleep? Right? And with the lymphatic system, I don't know if I know you know all about the lymphatic system, and basically it's a part of our lymphatic system within the central nervous system that goes in there and actually works as a hydraulic pump within our cerebral spinal fluid to wash away any of these bioaccumulated misfolded proteins that might accumulate in the brain.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
lymphatic mobilization clearance is a very big part of this entire process as well to pull away some of those bioaccumulated proteins. So, sleep
Yeah.
optimization is critical. And then, eating for detox, right? There's some evidence about cilantro having some mild chelation benefits, beets, yucca, having some additional, binding effects, so there's different foods that can help support, the detox pathways. And for that, I like to reference one of my colleagues, Deanna Minnick's work, eating across a rainbow and spectrum of different colors of phytonutrients, because
Mhm.
again, those phytonutrients play a very important role at supporting some of those epigenetic, epinutrient signals needed for favorable gene expression, supporting detox and elimination.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. No, that was a amazing overview. Super fascinating and specific. So I guess the perfect routine you use that on a daily basis you do some sort of movement, specifically movement that would stimulate your lymphatic system, and the best form of that is something related to compression or bouncing, like running, jumping, rebounding. I guess foam rolling or this dry brushing or massaging would also count as a lymphatic drainage routine. So you need to like move the lymph and hydrate properly, eat sufficiently enough fiber that you would go for number two on a regular basis, which I think is very underappreciated. That people would say that okay, fiber is useless, that it's not an essential nutrient. Yeah, but in today's world, your toxic burden is so much higher that you probably need to go for number two a bit more often as well to bind to even like air pollution. Like you could live the most purest lifestyle, but if you're in a close by to some bigger city, then you will be exposed to more air pollution uh,
Yeah,
just by that. So yeah, fiber intake is underrated in that regard, and sleep optimization with everything related to that. We're not going to go into details of that, but just going to bed on time, blocking out artificial light, and sleeping in the darkness. All those things would help with melatonin production as well, which I think is also involved in these pathways related to detox.
Yeah, the chronobiology of it's very, interesting because, arguably, based on different clock gene activation, there's different organ tissues, a part of our detox pathways that have heightened, expression, with, I think, the liver, being mostly associated around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, from my understanding. So, mitigating the different air pollutant or light pollution, to optimize or minimize the suprachiasmatic nuclei reflection on those photoreceptors on the eyelid to optimize the melatonin production is going to be essential at, you know, um, getting some of those chronobiological signalings orchestrated appropriately. So the chronobiome is a whole nother, very fascinating topic of, bioregulatory, kind of support. So
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah, you
fantastic.
mentioned the water. So, mineral water contains a lot of different minerals
Yeah.
that support your glutathione production, like sulfur and etc. Do you? I have seen some evidence from some smaller studies from Europe that bathing in mineral water, like the sulfur baths and drinking mineral waters, first of all, they do help with constipation and bowel movements, but they might also actually help to excrete some heavy metals. Have you seen any evidence like that?
I have not seen evidence about mineral water specifically. And, the things that you just, for me, naturally, I love, you know, spring water that's naturally mineralized, right? I
Hmm.
feel as though it's incredibly hydrating, alkalizing, and supporting to the cells. But minerals play a very important role in, the detox process because as you're mobilizing stuff out of your system, you need to replenish, the mineral storage that's being depleted or also, the good leaving with the bad, so to speak, right? And doing multi-mineral complex is very important in, heavy metal detoxes, so if we find somebody with, a high burden of mercury, lead, or arsenic, whatever it is, and you decide to move towards a targeted detox approach with some level of, it doesn't have to be intravenous chelation, but, whatever it is, heavy metal support, there's oftentimes a multi-mineral complex that's there to help with that ionic exchange to help your body shed and release some of these, trivalent cations that have very strong affinity to very specific tissue. It all boils down to charge again,
Mm.
and looking at certain binders have charge, like for example, the drug and medication cholestyramine. Welcol, which is used in a lot of these mold detoxes. That is a, very specifically charged particle, right? It's a quaternary ammonium and has a specific charge that binds to the mycotoxins and helps eliminate it out. And it's very well established that that is a very strong binder that targets mycotoxins and prevents enterohepatic microcirculation. You
Mm.
mentioned the sulfur baths, and I think about there's a resort near me here in West Virginia, 4 hours away, called the Greenbrier. And the Greenbrier is very beautiful resort. They have this whole crazy underground kind of system that was, linked to DC and used as a, kind of a place for people just in case there's like a nuclear fallout to go
Right.
to and bunker down. But the Greenbrier out in West Virginia has amazing sulfur springs, and you go there and you do a sulfur baths. And then when you're actually at the Greenbrier, you see all, along the walls, very old school, all the theoretical clinical benefits of curing rheumatological issues and
Mm.
treating all sorts of different issues. If you have this disease, come and soak in the baths, the sulfur baths. It's going to
Yeah.
be a cure all. And again, there's these natural hot pockets of sulfur springs all over the world, and arguably have some level of therapeutic benefits, as a part of the elimination process. Same thing with like an Epsom salt bath, driving magnesium into the tissue,
Hmm.
for muscle relaxation and recovery. I
Yeah.
do think those baths, different forms of hydrogen baths, sulfur bath, and so forth, all have some therapeutic benefit. And
Yeah.
if not, it feels fun. It
Yeah.
relaxes the autonomic nervous system and it lets you release.
Mm. Yeah. In the past, that was the one of the main medical interventions that people in Greece and medieval Europe and even during the Renaissance and Victorian era, they just told people to go to these spas, which were just mineral baths in nature, and I don't know. Anecdotally, they appear to work for some conditions, and there are like some studies as well, seeing that they provide some relief, especially even for like pain management, especially like joint pains and those things appear to be most beneficial.
Yeah, the certain springs in Budapest and so forth, are also a part of, having those, healing properties. And look, are we gonna be able to tell you to go take a spring bath and that's gonna cure your cancer? No, but
Right.
it could be a part of, like, the healing process. And, if not, how many people actually take baths on a regular basis or showering, right? And being able to take the time to slow down, unplug, leave the phone off, light a candle, right? And sit down and calm the nervous system down in a therapeutic, tranquil environment. And that effect on the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic load, I think, has the ability for the body to release
Mm,
because that's a very important concept that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to. If you're in this fight
right.
or flight state all the time, you're holding on to things. Your tissues are tough, right? Your tissues are just ready for some sort of response to a threat, and it doesn't allow us to rest, digest, and eliminate vers
Mm,
and when we get locked into that sympathetic dominant state, our body holds on to things, and I think, part of the therapeutic benefits of these baths is shifting the autonomic nervous system towards a state of higher coherence, with the heart rate variability and vagal nerve output and everything else. It's just such a beautiful thing and is essential for releasing in the healing process.
mm. Yeah, I would imagine if you are tensed up and your muscles are tight, then your lymphatic system probably isn't working properly. So
Correct. Yeah.
relaxation of the muscles with like foam rolling or massage probably is an important part as well.
Oh, yeah. I love my massages. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can now move on with or actually, I want to also mention, so taking clay in the morning or activated charcoal or something. These binders, do they actually work, and when is the best time to take them?
So, I know that there are these charts out there that say, hey, if you have this mycotoxin, in the urine analysis to match it with, charcoal, zeolite clay, or whatever. I just question the research and evidence around that and its actual clinical utility. I'm not saying it doesn't have, other binding properties to go in there and have the affinity towards heavy metals or some of these other kind of compounds. But, I just don't know if it's going to have the same therapeutic benefit as a binder as it relates to mold toxicity and chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So I know that's heavily debated amongst that community when dealing with mold and its ability to inflict the immune system. And we could unpack that a little bit further if you want. But I do think, look, it will have detox promoting benefits for very specific indications. Um, yeah, so I do think, it does have benefit, generally
Mm,
speaking. I love chlorella, charcoal is it's a r charcoal, activated charcoal is what is used in the hospital if you overdose on Tylenol,
mm,
right? So if you overdose on Tylenol, you're gonna come in and they're gonna mix this black soup, right? They don't even give you the capsules, it's gross, and you gotta drink that crap down
right.
for um, you know, Tylenol toxicity because it has the ability to go in there and prevent, some of the intermediate metabolites of Tylenol, NAPQI specifically, NAPQI, for Tylenol hepatotoxicity. So it goes in
Mm,
there and mitigates the stress on that system. So yes, charcoal works. Chlorella, binds to heavy metals. Cilantro extract, some research on heavy metals. Clay, more absorbent and non-specific and pulls things out, generally speaking, right? So there are different, agents that are out there that are used commercially for different clinical applications.
gotcha. And you don't want to take them with food or like other supplements or something like that. You just want to take
Oh,
them away from food.
away.
And,
you
Yeah.
gotta, yeah, take it away, right? So when it comes down to binders and me, I say 1 hour before or 3 hours after any drug or medication or supplement, right? Because
Mhm.
it's gonna go in there and interfere and absorb. These things work like molecular sponges, and they just wait and they hang out and they absorb and eliminate things and prevent its absorption in your system.
Gotcha. What about after a sauna? Is that a good time to take it or before?
That's a great question. I don't think there's any real research that I've seen on binders in relation to saunas, but I would, personally do it maybe before, so because you got to think about the transient time of digestion in relation to, the sweating and then
Mhm.
the rehydration post sauna therapy. You want to make sure we're assimilating and absorbing the minerals, after sauna. Again, I usually like to do coconut water after my sauna therapies, right?
Mhm.
Great source of magnesium and other trace minerals. And I usually do my sauna at nighttime right before I shower and go to bed. Um, yeah, so, binders, I typically recommend, depending on the clinical situation, 2 to 3 times a day, usually morning, lunch, and evening, right? Or morning and evening. As it relates to sauna, I would probably take it before going into the sauna. Again, the transient time that's needed for it to make its way into the small intestine as it relates to, your exercise and recovery. Because, if you're doing a true kind of rebounding and detox, if you're jumping rope and jumping on the trampoline, then jumping in the sauna, to help with the biotransformation and elimination, I think that's kind of a nice little targeted approach.
Gotcha. Are there any other like supplements that could be taken on a daily basis? Some NAC or glutathione, melatonin.
Yeah, there's all of those are very important to help support, biotransformation, detox, and elimination. I really think that again, I look at things in the context of N of one medicine. So, like there's all sorts of things that help support detox, like you alluded to, NAC, even B vitamins, right? So again, going back to cytochrome P450s and looking at phase one detoxification, all the B vitamins are really needed to support that, milk thistle, what's a role of milk thistle? What's a role of dandelion, extract as a cholagogue? And cholagogues basically help squeeze the gallbladder, through CCK activation and cholecystokinin, and basically allows your body to mobilize that bile acid from the gallbladder into, the digestive system. And then the theory is once you squeeze the gallbladder, you go in there and you have that sponge, right? Whatever binder it might be. I prefer, well-called cholestyramine in a targeted, mold situation to go in there and absorb that bile to prevent its enterohepatic recirculation. So there are numerous different forms of compounds, vitamin E, zinc, different amino acids. All of those things play a very important role. But yes, you alluded to, the role of N-acetylcysteine, which is very important glutathione precursor. And as we know, glutathione is your body's master antioxidant. Um, you know, um, there's IP6 from Rice Bran that's been shown to also help with biotransformation. There's the role of artichoke as well. Very important. Burdock root, chicory, berberine, all those things help stimulate kind of the phase one detox. Phase of elimination. So there's multiple different things, and for my patients that I see here clinically, I typically run very specific testing to identify those micronutrient deficits, right? So from a therapeutic perspective, it's in my practice, I run what's called a multi-omic analysis. So I get DNA on everybody. I get proteomics, metabolomics, exposomics, microbiomics, right? It's a lot of information, but these different molecular layers tell us a story and tell us where our deficits and excesses are, where our threats are, and what we need to focus on. If the gut is all not good, right? If like there's leaky gut and there's increased zonulin activity and there's signs of leaky gut, and I look at your blood under my microscope and there's signs of endotoxemia, we got to focus on the gut first, right? Because leaky gut, leaky brain. And the next thing you
Mhm.
know, you're gonna mobilize, some of these toxins into your central nervous system if the intestines aren't appropriately healed. So there's a very specific therapeutic order, and just going in there and saying, "Hey,
Mhm.
I'm gonna start detoxing."
Right.
No, you can't manage what you don't measure, and test, don't guess. Get those kind of that baseline, understand what the hell we're dealing with. First, mitigate exposure. Go home and detox your house and your environment and everything else. Try to support the system naturally with the lifestyle things that we've done. And then, if the gut is okay, all right, then we can move into a targeted detox phase, right? And,
Mhm.
the big thing that you would want to keep in mind is, yeah, you're going to want some things that are going to help with biotransformation and detox formulas. You're going to want to have some natural chelators and binders a part of it. You want to provide the micronutrients needed for phase 1 and phase 2, whether it's amino acids, B vitamins, and so forth. And also, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate antioxidant signaling there so that, as we force the elimination, that your body's not going to basically um, oxidize or get taxed based on that additional stress. And that's going to be your glutathione, your vitamins A, C, E, selenium, and zinc, and vitamin C, right? Very important at boosting that as well. Things that boost NRF2 signaling, which is our natural endogenous antioxidant pathway signaling on a genetic level, NRF2, right? Things like broccoli sprout extract and resveratrol,
Mhm.
all very important kind of components in a targeted detox. Increasing your fiber, right? All that stuff's very important. So, as you move through a detox plan, right, I think it's very important to identify what we're going to address, how we're going to address it, test, don't guess, right? And there's other therapies out there too. I think the role of therapeutic plasma exchange, which is basically pull the blood out, filter it, and, pull out all the plasma, exchange it with albumin, put it back in, pulling out all that stuff, not, all the toxins in circulation has some therapeutic benefits. There's research that was recently published through the Buck Institute that looked at, the role of therapeutic plasma exchange in reversing clock gene and biological aging activity. Right. There's also, some very interesting research around EBOO, extracorporeal blood ozonation oxygenation. This technique we use in our office too. Pull the blood out, filter it, ozonate it, illuminate it, and put it back in, right? And basically that helps, you do an oil change. Not only
Right.
are you doing an oil change of the blood, right, and pulling out all the bad stuff, you're also enhancing the ozonides in the system. And those ozonides actually work on those NRF2 signaling pathways, works on AMP kinase, right? So it's going to help with metabolic priming and sensitivity and has multiple therapeutic benefits. So, a part of any longevity stack, I think, is looking at the appropriate cadence of some of these different therapies, whether it's TPE or EBOO, right? In regards to supporting some of these bioelimination pathways and supporting NRF2 signaling. Does
Hmm.
that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's ways to actually just filter the blood and take out various microplastics, heavy metals, and even autoimmune related proteins and things like that. But yeah, they tend to be more costly, and you know there's a certain barrier for them. But there's evidence that they do work, and they are being used quite a lot. But you mentioned one thing very interesting, that you need to fix your gut, because otherwise you're just reabsorbing those toxins that you detox. So maybe we can walk through of the importance of having some sort of a prioritization. So first, yeah, you test and figure out what is the issue. But let's say, I would imagine most people who might struggle with symptoms related to toxin accumulation, they tend to also have some intestinal permeability, because for to reach toxin accumulation that reaches some actual symptoms, you need to have some sort, where does it come from in the first place. And the intestinal permeability is one of the most common routes into the blood for the outside world to get into our blood. So is there any specific things people need to do to fix the gut? And once they are already stimulating all these detox pathways, right, with these various lifestyle interventions and supplements, etc., is there other ways to promote them, um, or prevent them from being reabsorbed as well? So, like, first, how can they fix the gut? Any specific things there? And secondly, to prevent them from being reabsorbed, to actually make them excrete.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, Hippocrates said all disease begins in the gut, right? And
Hmm.
I think that has to refer to multiple different things as it relates to our immune system, because 70% of our immune system resides in the gut in the form of GALT, gut associated lymphoid tissue. I also believe that our barrier systems, it's one of our key barrier systems throughout our body. So we have different barriers, and our barrier systems, most importantly, are, in our digestive system, our bronchial system. Arguably, that's like 90% of our barrier system that we need to pay attention to. So what we're breathing in and what we're eating is going to have a tremendous impact on, the permeability due to that chronic inflammation. So preceding this issue with the gut has to deal with chronic inflammation leading to damage, and that damage increases the permeability of that tissue, allowing for transcellular or paracellular migration of things that were selectively permeable before. Now that selective permeability is no longer there. The filter is no longer there. That safety net's no longer there, and we have larger macromolecules absorbing and getting into the system. So, when it comes down to gut health first, and that's why I do a staggered multi-omic approach with my patients, is know the genetic predispositions, know what's going on within, the proteomic signatures, look at the metabolomics, what's going on a metabolomic level, what's going on a microbiomic level, because arguably some of the microbiome testing I do looks at also some of the gut physiology, right? And then what's going on at an environmental toxin level. Those 5 core omics signals for me clinically is a huge snapshot. Now, do I do transcriptomic testing, looking at RNA and so forth? Yes. And I do epigenetic testing. All those are kind of luxury items, depending on the clinical presentation. But when you look at the gut and the microbiome and you start seeing that there's dysbiosis, imbalance of gut bacteria. There's exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, EPI. We're not digesting and emulsifying our food properly. There's histamine issues with EPX protein. There is fecal calprotectin due to transmigration of leukocytes or white blood cells into the gut wall. Um, and we start seeing these different patterns. There's very zonulin leaky gut, right? There's a very specific targeted approach that we need to address those issues with, depending on what the person is showing and demonstrating. So for me, I like to look at all those key pieces of information and determine, do we have to focus on the gut first,
Mm.
right? The answer is not always yes, right? Some people have fantastic digestive systems, but they're just eating shitty food all the time. And there might be, organophosphates, or they like to golf. They live near a golf course, within 3 miles of a golf course. And the glyphosate is aerosolized and they're huffing it down and it's bioaccumulating in their system, right? Or, it is the phthalates and parabens or the microplastics, whatever the heck it is, right? So
Mhm.
it just depends on the data points, right? So when it comes down to the digestive health, for me, for test, don't guess, see what's going on. If we have to focus on gut first, I lead with gut first. And then, if there's malabsorption patterns and you're trying to give them oral supplementation, shit's not going to be absorbed. No
Right.
pun intended, right? The supplements aren't going to be used, and there's going to be malabsorption, and your body's not going to use, and you're just going to be having expensive feces, right? And
Mm.
expensive urine, because your body's assimilation of these micronutrients are not going to be there. So,
Yeah.
in that case, I would personally work on the gut, the dysbiosis, the malabsorption, and all those factors first, whatever it is, through targeted, specific nutraceutical supplementation or drug medications. And, if somebody needs Creon, we got them Creon, which is, pharmaceutical grade digestive enzymes. If we, need to do a low histamine, low oxalate, low whatever diet, we figure out the dietary components matched with your genetics. Then if we need to, heal the gut, there's so many different leaky gut protocols out there, whether it's incarnitine, glutamine, BPC 157, the bone broth, whatever the hell it is, to go in there and try to help promote the healing of the gut. But you still have to mitigate those stressors or those inflammagens that led to the degradation to begin with. So it's about identifying those threats to cellular integrity. And then, if there's malabsorption issues and they're profound, like the patient I had right before you, before jumping on this podcast, fantastic guy, you know, did a lot of the bulk of the testing, and, malabsorption through the roof, and, really high, 8-OHDG and lipid peroxides indicating cytotoxicity and DNA and genotoxicity, DNA damage. So the therapeutic order around that is like, okay, we're going to do some IVs, and then we're going to do nutraceuticals to clean up the gut. So we're going to replete the profound level of micronutrient deficiencies from years of malabsorption, dysbiosis, and all sorts of stuff. And again, I got these tests for him covered by Medicare,
Mm.
covered by insurance here in the US, some of them, most of them, right? And that's a very fun dance to do. But so now we developed a therapeutic protocol that's going to be replenishing the micronutrients intravenously to give the body the cofactors it needs to heal. We're going to remove those ongoing exposures. We're going to pull out the toxins through what I have next door with all the different tools and technologies from lymphatic mobilization and so forth, get them ready for EBOO, right? Ultimately, and, do the lymphatic and ozone sauna and so forth to just, move things. Did not have increased gut permeability, so there's no healing of the intestines needed. That was intact. Barrier was intact. But just had a really high toxic body burden. So, everything is N of one in my practice, right? I don't there are protocols or guidelines based on best practices on how to approach and structure a therapeutic intervention, but I adopt it for the person uniquely.
Mhm.
Um, I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question? It makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah. One question I got was you mentioned the pesticides with being near a golf course. There was this recent study
Yep.
a few weeks ago that people who were the closest to the golf course had a higher risk of Parkinson's, and they think it's the glyphosate from the drinking water and things of that they spray on the golf course. So this raises the question of, should you buy organic food or uh, if you live next to some sort of a big farm that has glyphosate sprayed or some other pesticides, how big of a concern do you think that is, and should people buy, 100% organic and 100% even let's say grass-fed versus grain-fed, this factory farmed meat versus some regenerative farm meat because of the antibiotic use, etc. Like how big of a concern those things are to the exposome and the person's health?
That's a fantastic question, and actually that was a study that I was referring to as well. I've
Hmm.
had patients that don't golf that live within 3 miles of golf course that have glyphosate through the roof. They eat organic. So, is it in the water or is it aerosolized is a question, and its association with neurodegeneration is a very important component in looking at somebody's, intrinsic capacity or longevity as a whole. So with that being said, whether or not to eat 100% organic, my take is, there's a Dirty Dozen and Clean 15 by the Environmental Working Group here in the US that kind of lays out, some of the different produce that have a low residue burden, that you could get away with. Things with a thicker shell that you're able to peel away tend to be less of a exposure compared to something that you eat the skin for. Obviously, always err on the side of precaution. Try to go organic wherever you can, but life is life, and you're going to go out to a restaurant, and then you're going to have berries that are inorganic. And do you wash the berries in your drinking water before you eat? I don't know.
Right.
I've been in so many interesting circles where people are doing some fascinating things that it's just like, all right, just shy of bringing your own food to a dinner. Well, people do that too. Bring their own food to a dinner. Thing. And that's a little whatever. But again, it's not about fear, it's about resiliency. You want to be able to go through life and have the ability to run through things, detox, eliminate, and not have it slow you down. What's that allostatic burden? How do we cultivate resiliency? Is there a low level of hormetic benefit to that level of stress, generally speaking? I think there's some level of hormesis that could be there, but when it comes down to toxins, you got to pick and choose your poison. Alcohol is completely different than like organophosphates, right?
Mm.
And arguably both toxic, right? We know that alcohol is associated with all sorts of bad things, but in moderation, arguably might have some benefit. And I think a lot of that has to do with the socialization of it and
Mm.
the ability to decompress and be with friends and in a positive environment and share, fun stories and laugh. Some of the best conversations and laughter I've ever had was around, you know, at a bar with friends and colleagues, right? And those are
Right.
very valuable. So, when it comes down to 100% organic. Again, you could use Dirty Dozen Clean 15 as a kind of a guiding light. When it comes down to factory versus regenerative farming practices, obviously, always go regenerative. Grass finished, grass fed, grass finished. Here in the U.S. is going to be one of our target goals. Because not just because it's grass fed means that it's been finished that way. So, from my understanding, fed and finished is very important. And then, yeah, filtered water. What does the water look like? And I try sparingly not to drink tap water from restaurants. At my home, we have like a double reverse osmosis system with remineralization, alkalization, and a couple of other features to the water. And I've been gifted a bunch of these weird things where you spin the water with the stuff and I don't know, it
Mm,
creates the structure and all that crap. I
right.
don't know if it works, but it tastes different, pre and post. So, I do some of that action. But, if you're at a restaurant, try to, be
Mm,
cautious with, the ice cubes. If you were to look under the, most ice maker machines, if you've ever been in
mhm.
somebody's backyard, restaurant and looked at the ice maker, mold everywhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right? That's a hidden exposure. So ice cubes, unfiltered water in the restaurants, unfiltered water at home. Like I have some friends that are like, "Oh, we're just gonna drink tap." And I'm like, "Th- maybe that's a little bit of hormetic stress, but generally speaking, you would want to get some nice, if we're, 80% water, you want some good quality water, man. Spend the
Yeah.
money, whatever, get the system, your home dialed in, put in the filters, and everything to get that dialed in to mitigate that exposure. Why not? It's a
Yeah.
one-time investment. It's going to last you a lifetime.
Yeah. It matters what you're most exposed to and what you're consuming the most. So if, let's say, someone eats meat once a week, right? Then it's less of a concern if it's grass fed and grass finished versus factory farmed meat because they only eat it once a week. But you drink water every day and several liters. Ideally, you cook your food in it. You wash yourself as well in it. If the water is dirty, then that exposure accumulates a lot because you're exposed to it the most. And the same with what you eat the most. Someone might eat a lot of let's say olive oil or fish or something, but if that fish is high in heavy metals and you're eating it every day, then it's going to accumulate it. Whereas versus if you eat fish once a week, then it's not going to be a big deal that much.
Correct. And, back to the water and like showering and bathing and soaking in the water, very important concept is, with water as you shower is the concept of free radical halogenation, right? And that refers to going back to the periodic table of elements and looking down the column of, the halogens. And we got chlorine, fluorine, and bromine all having, higher electronegativity versus iodine. So, and this relates to thyroid function. So, if we're being exposed not only through vaporized water in the shower that has chlorine, fluorine, and bromine, and we have thyroid issues and our iodine's not being absorbed because it's being displaced by these stronger, bulkier, cations, or I'm sorry, anions that are displacing, the iodine in our system. That's a big thing, and if you go and start measuring some of that, you'll see like low iodine in like 24-hour urine collection. You might see compromised zinc and selenium. And then you run, some sort of toxic test, and you're going to see, different fluoride compounds and derivatives that are high, bromide derivatives that are high as well, right? So free radical halogenation is a part of like kind of that regular daily exposure, unknowingly to our system.
Mm, yeah. Maybe we can go through some more these advanced cases as well. We're not going to go through the exact protocol of how to do it, but let's say you know mold illness. Um, what are some steps for not all steps, but let's say is there anything specific, any special drugs or pharmaceuticals that are used for that? Any special therapeutics like EBO or something like that, and any special tests that people should look out for?
Oh, Sim. This is a very loaded question. So I will share with you what I historically would do for mold-related illness. Now, I worked very closely. I'll start the conversation off with the caveat that I worked very closely with Dr. Heyman, Andrew Heyman, for many years in his practice in Virginia, through George Washington University, and that was very tied into the research endeavors with Dr. Shoemaker and the Shoemaker Protocol. And I know that there's, Campbell and Shoemaker and Neil Nathan and all these different arguments about who is right when it comes down to mold. And how do you assess it? How do you treat it? How do you mitigate it and everything else? So after exiting managing a lot of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, SIRS, I will start the narrative off that, with your story. And your story is very unique between Sim and Inca. You were living in mold for 20 years, no issues. Inca comes in, moves in, happy to be with the great Simlad. And all of a sudden she's getting sick living with you. And it's not you, my friend, it's the mold, right? She was manifesting symptoms, right? That caused her immune system to wear down, right? So the issue with this is 25% of the patient population carries a very specific genetic haplotype with their HLA genes that predisposes them towards immunological hypersensitivity to environmental exposures. Okay. So again, 25% of the population is genetically predisposed to being sensitive to these different biotoxin threats in our environment. Now, when faced with that environmental threat, a part of your immune system turns on, right? And doesn't have the ability to turn off, right? And we could see that on a transcriptomic level. And essentially you have then, whether it was years ago in college or, the other day, or chronic exposure in your office, whatever the hell it is, right? You have that insult to injury in the genetically predisposed that creates this chronic inflammatory response. And this is a multi-symptom clinical manifestation of this inflammatory immune-mediated process. And again, what I have seen is very interesting because we did the transcriptomic testing, we did the data, we found all these different threats of biotoxins to the genetically predisposed. There's a very specific algorithm that I historically followed. I no longer manage, chronic mold in my practice. You know, I'm I just don't have the bandwidth anymore with the Board of Precision Medicine and everything else. There's a lot of hand-holding, that is required with this. There's a lot of, I would say, coaching and neuropsychiatric support that is needed for this, inflicted population. They need support beyond what I could offer in my private practice. So I'm going to lead with, and long story short, the testing process for me historically was, yes, we would get all your conventional biomarkers associated with that immunological expression of chronic, of biotoxin as it relates to SIRS. That includes HLA testing, MMP9. We would get C4A specifically from National Jewish in Colorado because that is the reference lab. Because again, if you were to go to LabCorp, they're using a diluting agent in their test that serially dilutes out and denatures the C4A biomarker. We look at VEGF and MMP9 and what else? MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and we would get that biomarker baseline. We would then look at in our severe cases, because oftentimes we were the last stop on the train for a lot of these folks grappling with SIRS. We've been to, a bunch of different doctors, all sorts of weird diagnoses, all sorts of unique protocols, but they didn't track or trend, the key components of this entire protocol. We also use what's called a visual contrast sensitivity test that has been clinically validated by the DOT to measure neuroinflammation based on chronic inflammation of the brain in the optic region and the optic nerve that compromise your ability to distinguish contrast differential within your visual kind of acuity there. And essentially, that is demonstrating neuroinflammation. And we use that to trend and track that level of neuroinflammation and systematic improvement with the binder. And the binder we would use is cholestyramine and Welchol, arguably. And the only other thing that has been shown to have the right charge is beets and okra extract
Hmm.
as a binder to go in there and help specifically bind to biotoxin. Then we would look at the transcriptome, the RNA testing. So again, if your DNA is the instruments to your own symphony orchestra, we're going to measure the melody coming off of that instrument. Is it upregulated or downregulated in, vibrational frequency or gene expression? And certain things like the mitochondria were always downregulated. And this phenomenon is known as molecular hypometabolism, which is associated with cell danger response. Again, you can look at the research of Dr. Robert Nathanow and cell danger response to get a better understanding of what that insult means and the different phases of CDR and how that relates to the healing process. So once we have that information, the VCS tests, the biomarkers in labs, transcriptomic testing, we also want you to test your home, right? And the company that is being endorsed now is Live Biotech Fungi 10 test, right? It goes beyond a Hurt Me 2 test or ERMI test. It has more speciations of mold comparatively. And so we would get Live Biotech Fungi 10 for mold. And then there's two other tests that we found due to the prevalency of water damage building not being just mold. It's polymicrobial in nature, right?
Hmm.
Meaning you're going to have bacteria and viruses, bacteriophages and all sorts of different things. So that's when we recommend also when you test your home to also test with envirobiomics for actinomycetes and endotoxin. Right now, it's very interesting what we found with the bulk of these folks that are dealing with water damage building, CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. I think over 52% of individuals were suffering from the exposure to something called a species of bacteria called actinomycetes, right? Actinomycetes is very unique. It's a bacteria that looks and behaves like a mold. To me, it's like the life bridge between a eukaryote and a prokaryote, a mold and a bacteria, right?
Hmm.
It's a gram-positive facultative anaerobic filamentous spore-forming bacteria. What the hell does that mean? It's a bacteria that behaves like a mold, okay?
Mhm.
What we found is most people are colonized with it on our skin, just like we're colonized, if you've ever worked in a hospital, you're probably colonized with MRSA, right? But the thing with this actinomycetes, it releases this neuroinflammatory toxin. And this toxin activates complement, C4A. And C4A, complement activation, leads to the activation of MAC, membrane attack complex. A membrane attack complex, as the name implies, pokes hole in your membranes, causes the membranes to be leaky, not good. And then that signals apoptosis. And that
Hmm.
apoptosis could be taking place in your brain, your lung. It could be affecting your ability to climb up a flight of stairs and upregulates HIF1A, H1F, hypoxia-inducible factor 1A. We would see that on transcriptomic testing. It signals MAP kinases, and those MAP kinases are involved with, the secondary signal transduction towards the whole MAC membrane attack complex, ultimately. And so what we found is that most of these people are colonized with this bacteria that have dwelled in a water damaged building, and it's not necessarily the mold. Mold was like less than 15, percent of, mold related or CIRS, in that water damaged building scenario. Mold was very low in the prevalence of the research from Shoemaker. And again, I stick with the Shoemaker protocol because it's the most evidence-based research published system. As an MD, I got to go with the research. I'm not going to go with like bullshit, low grade, expert opinion. There's a lot of opinions out there, and you know what they say about opinions.
Right.
They're like assholes. Everybody's got one and they all stink. So we need to make sure we stick grounded with the research and evidence to support what we're doing. And I'm not saying, there's no validity to the other testing of other folks. I'm just saying, hey, this is kind of what I've been trained in. And I do think there's some utility of other forms of testing and other, binders and other protocols. You ask the question, does EBU fit into this role? And I do think Ebu fits into this role. I do think sauna fits into this role. I do think alternative binders have a potential role in all this. And it's not always just mold. It's like accumulation, as we discussed in this entire podcast, of different environmental toxins that is not just from a water damaged building, but it could be mycotoxins from your food. It could be the heavy metals and organophosphates, everything that we've discussed and unpacked. So we went over the testing, right, of the home, the blood, the transcriptome. We went over kind of the protocol with a VCS test and doing a binder, and that's going to be kind of the gauge. And then ultimately, there's a whole therapeutic protocol where you start looking at, different food sensitivity testing and, correcting gliadin antibodies, hormone optimization, looking at other kind of biomarkers, within this protocol. And then ultimately, you start correcting, like if TGF betas runs really high, there's really solid evidence about losartan, a ACE inhibitor compound, angiotensin receptor blocker, losartan, and its ability to drop TGF beta 1, you're right, transforming growth factor beta 1, right? And once you start correcting those biomarkers, you ultimately get onto intranasal VIP. That's the Shoemaker protocol. And the intranasal VIP is reportedly used to undo the nuclear atrophy in the brain and restore brain tissue neurogenesis. Now, with the ever evolving landscape, and this is where, I think there's so many different components that we could be looking into, like plasmalogens, right? I don't know if you're familiar with plasmalogens, but I've found a lot of folks that have this neuroinflammatory process due to these environmental biotoxic factors have low plasmalogens, and they also have really high ceramides to sphingomyelin ratios. When we start seeing ceramides accumulating in your system and the sphingomyelin's going down, that's not good, right? That's excessive neuronal cellular turnover, right? Brain on fire again. So there's all these different components, and I think the transcriptomic testing, the plasmalogen testing, these are all iterations on the traditional Shoemaker protocol. Instead of just looking at gliadin antibodies, do food sensitivity and allergy testing. Instead of just looking at correcting the androgens, look at the hormonal balance as a whole, right? And then, do you need VIP at the end, vasointestinal peptide, which is an intranasal peptide used to help restore the brain? I've seen some fantastic results from that,
Mm.
but I've also seen people where we got them 90% better without the VIP. Went on the VIP, and the benefit was marginal because they had the greatest therapeutic benefit, in that whole corrective therapeutic order, clearing the MARCONs. A big part of that's also clearing MARCONs. MARCONs are multi-antibiotic resistant coag negative Staph aureus. It's MRSA's bastard cousin, right? And people are colonized with MARCONs in their sinuses, and MARCONs releases this polytoxin, and this polytoxin actually works as a neuroinflammatory issue as well. So when it comes down to mold illness, right, and SIRS and binders and home testing and everything else, it's very N of 1
Mm.
with looking at the genetics, the transcriptomics, the envirobiomics, the neuroinflammatory burden, and looking at all those other confounding variables that are influencing their pathophenotype or their clinical presentation towards that disease.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question appropriately, and I'm sorry I went on my tangent there with that. I'm just like, I've got a little bit of PTSD as it relates to that because it was, dealing with mold illness is not easy from a clinical
Mm.
standpoint. And that's kind of why I stepped
Yeah.
back from managing it, in my private practice.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's very surprising how common it is. A lot of buildings have some water damage, especially older ones, and that inevitably leads to mold as well.
Yeah.
But maybe we can also cover a little bit about heavy metals. Is there any differences in the protocol with heavy metal exposure?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Once you get to a certain point in time within the protocol, usually after MARCON's testing and correcting the gut and balancing or trying to balance the hormones, around the hormone metal time testing, right? So because there's no point, according to the therapeutic order, to start hormones early, plus or minus a benefit on that. And again, I think, you will get to a point where you have to do the heavy metal testing, and, there might be a need for a chelation protocol, intravenous or oral, right? And, as you're getting to the gut, and that's why you do the gut phase before the hormone metal phase, you wanna work on the gut phase first, whether food sensitivity allergies, leaky gut syndrome, dysbiosis, leaky gut syndrome, right? To heal that process so you can move towards correcting the hormones and doing an appropriate detox. Does that make
Gotcha.
sense?
Yeah.
And so heavy metals is part of that equation. Again, everybody's, bucket's a little bit different. Their exposome is different. So,
Mm.
addressing it once they're at a more stable standpoint, because you don't wanna go and mobilize heavy metals in somebody that's neurologically inflamed, right? That's
Yeah.
just gonna stir the pot and make things worse. And, especially when they have extreme environmental hypersensitivities where light, sound, smell are all triggering events for migraines and headaches and all sorts of stuff. And you could see that actually on a transcriptomic level. So individuals that had a very unique signaling pathway on the Gini test had something called upregulation this of Icaros, which are some of these signaling molecules. And when there was a specific pattern of the Icaros signaling, it basically there was a these were my patients that unfortunately suffered from extreme hypersensitivity, light, sound, and smell. Even the wind blowing, they would just couldn't take it.
Mm.
So, in those cases, we actually would start VIP off low dose before we had actually started off earlier in the protocol, right? Low dose VIP intranasal to acutely stabilize things, right? Before moving up to, and VIP is really expensive. It's like, $600 a month, just for
Right.
that peptide. So, again, that's why you want to clear the Marcons because Marcons kind of deaminates and breaks down the VIP and all that other stuff. So there's a very specific therapeutic order and protocol associated with this.
Gotcha. But with heavy metals, is it more specifically focused on the liver detox pathways, or should you focus more on like sweating or something like that?
Great question. I think it's going to be a combination of both depending on it. And arguably, whether to do EDTA with calcium versus sodium for mercury versus lead, there's some very specific nuances. So it depends on the chelation protocol. But yes, supporting liver, kidney, and sauna elimination, all secondary to identifying which metal and which intervention you're going to move forward with. Right.
Hmm.
Because, could we do it naturally with cilantro? First of all, is it provoked versus unprovoked testing? There's some folks that only do provoked heavy metal testing based on some historical data and research. And this is where you take a little low dose DMSO before a heavy metal test to mobilize the heavy metals out of your system so it could be collected in the morning urine.
Mm.
And that helps push it out of the tissue, get into urine. They might also recommend a little bit of glutathione as well on top of the DMSO to do that testing to get that baseline of what heavy metals are there. And then depending on the heavy metal, you do a targeted chelation kind of protocol. But before you do that, correct the gut, remember. And then you support it with the appropriate chelation. And then you could do all the phase 1, phase 2 stuff on top of that as well.
Hmm. Gotcha. I've also heard that blood testing for heavy metals might not be that accurate, that you need to do a hair mineral analysis. Is that true, or?
I don't subscribe to the hair mineral analysis testing. I know that's highly debated amongst the functional medicine community.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's some studies that have questioned its clinical validity and utility. So I personally don't subscribe to the hair mineral analysis, not because I'm bald, all right? Before you start, think, oh, you bald guy, that's why you don't like the hair analysis. No, I just don't think it has the
Yeah.
same, clinical utility comparatively.
Gotcha. And maybe last thing we can cover briefly is microplastics. So these are very foreign, very new toxins. Not toxins per se, but I guess compounds we're exposed to, uh, and there's not that much clear evidence of how do you excrete them, if you can excrete them, etc. So, what is your approach to that to lower the burden of microplastics and nanoplastics?
Yeah, that's a great question, because they're everywhere from
Mhm.
They line the wrapper of any consumer stabilized product on shelf.
Yeah.
They line the inside of canned aluminum cans. They're on receipt paper and so on and so forth. So there's a tremendous exposure to these microplastics, and it first starts with mitigating exposure, identifying those threats and pulling it out. Cutting boards, plastic
Mm.
cutting boards release so much microplastics into the system,
Yeah.
right? So, number 1, identify and mitigate, remove that ongoing exposure. Number 2, are there any targeted detox paths or protocols for microplastics specifically? I have not seen any strong well, first of all, what test is valid,
Mm.
Um, and that's argued, that's heavily argued. And for me, as had a very interesting conversation with a couple of researchers regarding the clinical utility of testing microplastics, its validity and its actionability. And for me, I'm like, hey, you PhDs, go to the lab, figure out the best test, then let me know. I'll order it because still right now, getting a signal, some sort of signal is better than nothing,
Mhm.
right? Whether it's measuring all the different bisphenol metabolites and so forth, or if we're looking at surrogate markers metabolomically of microplastics, that's another way of doing it. There's this unique biomarker associated with that. And then once you get that information, it's cleanup. It's a biological audit of your environmental exposures to mitigate that ongoing stuff, right? And then in my experience, I like EBU, right? I'm about to get a machine in the office here from Germany called Inusferesis, which is the new modern version of TPE. And Inusferesis is basically, therapeutic plasma exchange without the exchange. It's a giant filtration that has very similar, if not identical benefits as TPE without the albumin correction.
Mhm.
So, gonna be getting that versus TPE in my office for that, process because the albumin correction, it could be a little bit cumbersome for certain patients and that have certain sensitivities. So, um, I think those blood filtration methods are gonna probably be one of the better ways
Mhm.
of pulling out some of these microplastics in circulation. Um, but I'm sure you've seen these microplastics are now being linked to atheroma plaques in the
Mhm.
arteries, right? So they're finding it everywhere in our tissues. They're just depositing, in areas of vulnerability. So, it's just that's not good. If it's in
Yeah.
our microvascular system and it's leading to microangiopathic lesions and creating that atheroma and that process of you know, uh, vessel damage. So I think again, it's we can't manage what we don't measure, and we should get a baseline, figure it out, and then develop a targeted protocol because do you start off with some oral supplementation, phase 1, phase 2? Do you do some IV stuff? Do you do some mechanical stuff like Flowpresso and, ozone sauna? And, even, I was speaking with some fantastic researchers from, Germany and I'm getting in my office here any day now, Celgin, which is intermittent hypoxic therapy. I don't know if you've seen that, but IHT, there's thousands of studies on this. And at the core of what this does, it actually works by stimulating mitophagy. It's going to pull out all the bad mitochondria. Right. So as you're pulling out, and this should be a part of a detox protocol, going in there with the intermittent hypoxic therapy and stimulating mitophagy, getting all the bad stuff out even before you hit somebody with photobiomodulation, right? From a biohacking perspective, you wait on PBM till after you've recycled and pulled out the bad mitochondria, you've mobilized the lymph, and you've done the ozone sauna, and you got all that stuff gone. And then you could look into TPE or EBU or those other kind of more advanced applications and protocols.
Mm.
I have patients that come in strictly for EBU on a quarterly cadence for longevity, right? Because again, it's almost like an oil change for them. They just feel better. I feel
Right.
better after I do it. So,
Mm.
yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, and, I guess it comes down to, uh
having the main detox pathways working regularly, and then, if needed, doing some more disfiltration techniques.
And I think with the future of the human exposome, TPE and in-use pheresis are going to be the greatest clinical therapeutic interventions to address this. That's
Mm,
evidence-based, evidence-driven. You could pre-post test it and identify a shift in the biochemistry, not just metabolomically, but also exposomically, pre and post.
yeah,
So, with the advancements of the Human Exposome Project, I definitely think we're going to be seeing, those therapies being our go-to right now to go in
yeah,
there and correct some of these burdens in our system.
yeah, yeah. So we can start wrapping up as well. We went really, really deep and detailed with this, and this is only like one chapter of your book that's coming out, the longevity solution. And yeah, I just wanted to do a specific episode on this specific chapter. And as I understand, your book is coming out quite soon, or it's like pretty like in a few weeks.
Yeah, I've been saying it for years, but I've finally got the book to a healthy place, and we're pushing it to publication here in the next few weeks, and we're going to be doing a marketing campaign. Would love to tap your audience. It's called the Longevity Equation, and it's just based on my crazy thought process in regards to years of accumulating this knowledge from some of the greatest teachers that I've had from around the world. I've made a lot of reference to European biological medicine and Austria and Germany, Switzerland, and so forth. And I've also studied with some amazing folks here in the US, since a teenager, from Michael
Hmm.
Murray, Andrew Weil, Peter Diadamo, all the Institute for Functional Medicine folks, A4M folks, and so forth. So this has been, a passion of mine since I was a teenager, and I tried my best to put it all into a comprehensive manuscript that kind of outlines the need for precision medicine testing with multi-omics, and then what do you do with that data? How do you optimize your environment? How do you mitigate the stress to ultimately enhance your intrinsic capacity, aka longevity?
Mm,
And the intrinsic capacity, I think, is very important to assess, because I put it in the context of biological 401k. We all have this internal biological health savings account for which we're making daily deposits and withdrawals into. And there's certain things that kind of subtract from our savings, and there's certain things that we can make deposits in. And I think we covered a lot of those factors here today,
mm,
with therapies and mitigation and so forth, gut health. And, how do we basically make these meaningful deposits so that we could actually, cultivate our ROI, and our ROI, return on investment, is going to be health span over a lifespan. And health span is essentially that intrinsic capacity. So,
yeah.
I lay all that out in the book. It's coming out soon. Hopefully we could, get it to your audience when it goes to publication here soon.
You have a specific date because
Uh, no, not yet.
okay,
But
yeah.
it's right there. It's right
Is it
there.
like August, right?
I'm shooting for August. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it depends when people hear it. So
Yeah.
if it's out, then it's gonna be in the link in the show notes.
Oh, thank you.
Well, yeah. Well, it's been a great talking with you, and yeah, we're really thorough. I enjoyed it a lot. So, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Oh, thank you, Sim. I have my private practice. I see patients from all over the country and world. I'm licensed in 40 something states. I have people internationally flying into me here with the Institute for Human Optimization. My website is ifho.org. So if you're on the patient side of things, I have patients coming in from all over the place. And then if you're a physician and wanting to learn more about precision medicine, I am the founder and president of the American Board of Precision Medicine, and our website is abopm.org. And essentially, we've created a training process to provide physicians, MDs and DOs only right now, with the foundational molecular framework to start thinking along the lines of multiomics and medicine, because this is the future of care. This is what I do clinically. I'm not saying it's better or anything. It's just different. And I think, it's important to connect those molecular dots. And if you look at the trend in diagnostics and research, everything's going multiomics, right? Getting those different molecular layers plays a very important role at characterizing individuals' unique flavor of their disease process, pathophenotype, or their longevity, So that's what I'm focused on, is changing the future health of America and the world with the Board of Precision Medicine, so that we could get physicians to start thinking along the lines of genome to phenome healthcare.
Gotcha. Yeah, we'll put the links in the show notes. And yeah, it was great to talk with you again. And yeah, looking forward to the book.
Always, Sim. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alright, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.